Thank you. I appreciate my friend allowing me to speak for a moment this afternoon. I'm talking in the context of a nomination we're likely to consider here on the floor this week. I'm told on Thursday we're going to be asked to confirm the President's nomination of Sylvia Burwell to be the next Secretary of Health and Human Services. This is a really important job for a number of reasons. One is it's the job that's in charge of implementing the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. And therefore, I think it's an appropriate time to talk about that. Talk about the urgent need for us to address some of the continued problems we've had with implementation. This whole subject of Obamacare, of course, has divided this chamber pretty sharply over the last few years. Part of the reason is that it was forced through the Congress without a single bipartisan vote. In other words, all Democrat votes, not a single Republican vote. And also it was kind of pushed through quickly, and so it resulted in a lot of problems. We've seen that in terms of the implementation of Obamacare generally, some of the computer problems, some of the concerns people have about having their health care canceled and so on. But what I want to talk about today is a specific issue with regard to implementation where I would hope we could be together, that this issue would unite us as Republicans and Democrats, and that we would take forceful action to deal with it. It's something that I think all of us can agree with because it has to do with the taxpayers. It has to do with money that might be going out under Obamacare that's not appropriate. It's ensuring that these subsidy payments in Obamacare are going to the people who actually qualify for them. As this chamber knows, starting on January 1st, the subsidies started to flow. And it provides subsidies to premiums, healthcare premiums, for low and middle income Americans who don't qualify for Medicaid, so are not under the poverty line, but are above the poverty line, actually above 133% of the poverty line. In fact, people who earn up to 400% of the poverty line are eligible for these subsidies. Recently, the Kaiser Foundation estimated the number of people who can legally qualify for these funds and receive them is about 6.6 million Americans. And these subsidies can be fairly large. They can exceed $10,000 a year, for instance, for a family of four. So we're talking about billions of dollars of taxpayer money. The question is, are they going to the right people? I think because there is so much money involved here, the American people should be able to rightly expect that the government has in place some sort of a system to ensure that the people who are supposed to get it are getting it, ensure that those who are claiming the subsidies, receiving the taxpayer dollars, are eligible for them. In January of this year, in response to a requirement actually that got into legislation that passed the Senate called the Ryan Murray budget, in response to that legislation where there was a requirement that there be some sort of process put in place, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, assured Congress in a letter that HHS had, and I quote, implemented numerous systems and processes to carry out income verification procedures. So she sent a letter to the Congress saying, don't worry about it, got it covered. We've implemented numerous systems and processes to carry out income verification procedures. Unfortunately, what we're finding out now, and here we are, gosh, 6 months later, that a lot of those assurances might not be accurate, that it appears as though they have not put in place these processes. The Washington Post wrote a recent article that got my attention. And it got my attention because it reported that, in fact, no permanent system has been built that is capable of verifying those eligible to receive the subsidies. In fact, according to internal reports that were obtained by the Washington Post, since no computer capability for verifying eligibility yet exists, Health and Human Services will begin sorting through all these applications by hand at some indefinite date in the future. So this is concerning. These internal reports are not reports that we have here in the Congress. They're not reports that my constituents have. The American people haven't been able to see these reports, but the Washington Post got a hold of some that showed, in fact, they have not put in this permanent system or an automated system of any kind that you would normally expect with this kind of money going out the door. So here we are in 2014, and the United States government is going to comb through, I guess, by hand, literally millions of documents of people who are claiming subsidies by hand, and try to figure out how to deal with it. It's like something out of a bad movie, but it's not a laughing matter because the consequences are significant. The Washington Post reports that the government may already be paying incorrect subsidies to more than 1 million people, although that's just a best guess. And these fraudulent payments, if that's accurate, of course, would then be costing the American taxpayers millions, maybe billions of dollars. When news broke about this problem last month through this story in the Washington Post, I wrote a letter to Secretary Sebelius at the Health and Human Services Agency. I also wrote it to the IRS commissioner, because the obvious thing to do would be to check the information that's given with the IRS records to see whether the 1040 matches up with what you're saying that your income is. And in the letter I said, can you give us the answers about these very serious questions that have been raised, and can you tell us what the Department of Health and Human Services is doing about this? I asked for a response by June 1st. It's now past June 1st, and I've received nothing but silence in response. And that's why I wanted to come to the floor today, to say, look, I don't think anybody on either side of the aisle here in the United States Senate thinks this is acceptable. Some on the other side might say, well, we're more concerned about people who aren't getting the subsidies that they're eligible for because the verification is not in place to help them. That's fine. The point is the subsidies ought to go to the people who are eligible. Whether they're overstating or understating their income and therefore made eligible or not eligible, there ought to be a system in place. And that's a minimum requirement, I would think, that we would all want to have in place to be able to, again, save these payments going out in a fraudulent way to the tune of what could be billions of dollars. I can't imagine that anyone thinks the current situation is acceptable. So we're going to see if HHS gets its act together and gets serious about enforcing these rules. I think it's going to require new leadership. And that's why I'm hoping that with the nomination debate this week of Sylvia Burwell to be the next Secretary of HHS, we can have a discussion about this issue, and that she can provide some of that new leadership from the top to ensure that indeed we do have accountability through the system and we can figure out whether this situation will be resolved. Unfortunately, I think it's also going to require leadership from the top, meaning from the White House as well. And this is not an isolated incident, unfortunately, of incompetence, I would say, on behalf of our federal government in implementing, in this case, a very complicated law. We've seen this recently with the scandal that has involved the VA health system. I mean, another big, complicated system that's obviously not working to take care of the needs of our veterans, who should be at the front of the line receiving the best care, and too often we find out are at the back of the line, or maybe aren't on the list at all, as we saw with regard to the Phoenix VA Center, where 1,700 people were just taken off the list altogether. We've seen it with regard to the IRS scandal, where you have the Internal Revenue Service actually going after Americans because of their political beliefs. Nothing could be more wrong in terms of building faith and trust in our federal system is to think that the tax collector is going after folks because of their political beliefs. So all these recent issues that have come up of incompetence and of the government not keeping the trust are a bad thing. A bad thing even in good times. Today is not good times because already that faith in the federal government is at record lows. The faith in this institution is at a record low, they say. It should be our responsibility to begin to rebuild that faith by doing things that make sense. And what's going on at HHS doesn't make sense. Everyone knows that, there needs to be a system in place and a permanent, automated system to deal with this. Same with the VA, same with the IRS. I hope we see that kind of leadership. I hope we can do that because it's the right thing to do for taxpayers, but it also rebuilds trust in the American government system. To do that is going to require some serious and immediate action. In the case of HHS, I call on the administration today to make good on the promise they made in January, where they said, no problem, we got it covered. We have the system in place to ensure that there aren't missed payments going out, that only folks who are eligible are going to get these payments. Let's, in the process of Sylvia Burwell's nomination, raise this issue. Let's encourage her to show leadership at HHS to be able to deal with this issue. Let's ensure that subsidies are going to the right people and that taxpayers are being protected.